Welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and I'm here with my co-host for this season, Gil Rendle. Hi, Gil.
Hey, Lisa.
So this season, we're exploring what it means to lead faithfully in a world that feels uncharted and unsettled. We're centering our conversations around Gil's newest work, Reimagining and Remapping the Religious Landscape, Chaos Before a New Ordering. In this monograph, Gil invites us to look at the changing landscape of faith through a new lens, not through the decline or growth of congregations, but through the ways people are making meaning in their everyday lives and really searching for meaning, if you will. It's a shift that opens our eyes to where spiritual life is actually unfolding in homes, workplaces, neighborhoods, and movements for justice, and how the Spirit is still creating new possibilities for belonging and purpose. You can find links in the show notes or on our website to Gil's full paper and to a short 2-page summary, which is designed to spark leadership conversations in your own congregation. Today's guest embodies so much of what Gil's work is pointing toward. Reverend Jen Bailey is a pastor, public theologian, and social entrepreneur who has been reimagining what spiritual community can look like in our time. We are also very proud to note that Jen is one of our Wesleyan Impact Partner 2021 Lock Innovative Leaders. Jen currently serves as Executive Director of the Dan and Margaret Maddox Fund, a Nashville-based foundation that invests in the next generation of leaders and organizations working to improve the lives of young people and protect Tennessee's natural environment. She is also the founder and former executive director of Faith Matters Network, a womanist-led organization that equips faith leaders, organizers, and activists for collective healing and social transformation. And as co-founder of the People's Supper, she's helped bring more than 10,000 people together for shared meals across lines of race, religion, and politics. You'll hear us talk about that. In all her work, Jen is helping people rediscover meaning and connection in a fragmented world. Gil, as you think about your recent work and this ongoing conversation about meaning making, what stood out to you in our conversation with Jen?
Well, the first thing I have to say, Lisa, is it's just it was a wonderful conversation, and to the point of that new map that I've been working with and everything. One of the axes that I use in order to create the field is this difference between sacred and secular.
Right.
And for people like me, when we grew up, it was a real clear difference. As soon as you stepped out of the church, you were into secular territory and everything like that. One of the things I hope that our listeners will listen for is that when Jen talked, she, as a person of the church, does not change when she goes out into what we used to call secular space. And when she's in secular space, she doesn't behave differently than she did in the church. And so, it points out that this is not a binary. This is really just a whole range of territory in which we live our lives. And she walks easily back and forth, which I think is true of so many of the social religious entrepreneurs. And so that she's the example. And so it helps us to know that when we're looking at things that we don't recognize, there's an awful lot more there than we're able to see.
Yeah.
So I hope folks will pay attention to that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think talking with somebody like Jen helps us look at the map that you're offering with a lens of not it's either this or it's that, as you've said, but even the quadrants and the place on the map, that's simply a way to open up the conversation.
Right.
And when we encounter somebody like Jen, who is deeply committed to the church, has been shaped by it, still very active in leadership in the church, and is a spiritual entrepreneur, you see, oh, okay, let's not get too rigid about the map, but let's let meaning making and the search for it and where we experience the Holy Spirit to kind of lead us in understanding it. And so it is helpful. Okay, let's listen to our conversation with Jen. Hi, Jen. It is so good to be with you. We've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, it's so good to see you, Lisa. Good to see you, Gil.
And you, and you.
Let's jump right in. And I want to start with Gil's monograph, which shifts the lens for us from congregations to people's search for meaning. And so I want to invite you to think about your own journey, if you will, and where you are with the Maddox Fund, but also Faith Matters Network and the People's Supper and even your engagement with congregations. So what do you see? What are you noticing about where and how people are seeking meaning today? And where is that search most alive?
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that question. Lisa, and thank you, Gil, for the work that you are up to right now, helping us understand, as you've done for so long, the nature of how we do this thing called faith. And as I think about my own sort of vocational and ministerial trajectory over the years, I think one thing that has remained at the core of how I understand my positioning theologically and community is that I've been on a search for a long time to create communities of belonging. And I think that for me began very young. I grew up in a small town, Quincy, Illinois, that at the time I was growing up was about 90% white, 10% all the rest of us, and had some pretty early experiences with othering, is the best way to put it, because of how I was embodied. And because of that, I sought places that I could belong. And the first place I found that was my church, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was a sacred space in which I was taught from a young age that I was divine and holy and beloved in the eyes of God, and was surrounded by other folks who, in this context, looked like me and came from similar backgrounds and origin stories. I was taught very early the story of Richard Allen and what it meant to exercise our faith by standing up for justice and human dignity as a young person. And I think throughout my life, that pattern of searching for and creating and curating spaces of belonging for those who've been pushed to the margins, however one, or historically excluded from spaces. If I could say there was a through thread to my ministry, it would be that. And so as I think about my journey through college and into divinity school at Vanderbilt and even beyond to founding Faith Matters Network in 2014 as a post-seminarian, so really several months after graduation, I think that the thing that drove me to found F&M in those days was recognizing, having done some work doing community organizing and direct outreach work, in particular around food access and food justice issues, is that people were finding the holy often in these third spaces that for a number of reasons. I'm a millennial, which used to mean something, but now as I'm like staring at 40 means less. As a mom, right? Like I'm not even an auntie era anymore. I'm now a mom of 2 kids, right? Who are Gen Alphas, right? But as a young person, and I think this may be true for young people, regardless of your generational orientation, right? Folks were feeling removed from congregational life, feeling like throughout their, at least I can speak for myself, throughout my adolescence, the church had become a hyper politicized space, right? It had become a space that had less theology and more ideology driving it. And as a result, for those of us who found ourselves asking tough questions of the biblical text, asking tough questions about what it meant to live our faith in a way that really did embrace the other and embrace the neighbor, folks left and were leaving, not necessarily their faith, but were leaving spaces that felt like they were exclusive to the point of exclusion. And so what I saw alive during my seminary days were these third places of community organizing, of nonprofits, of people who were creating sort of these spaces outside the four walls of the traditional congregation life to make meaning for themselves with their peers and with others. And so that was the sort of origin story of Faith Matters Network, which I led for 10 years. And I can see myself now carrying that through into my role now as executive director of the Dana Margaret Maddox Fund in Nashville, where a lot of our work and a lot of our funding goes towards partner organizations that are doing that very work of trying to cultivate a deeper sense of belonging here in Middle Tennessee. And so I do think that that sense of how we create spaces of belonging that tell the story of the human family and of community as one grounded in love is a task these days, and is perhaps not the, I don't know how to say this exactly, but not the driving narrative, right? People are finding meaning in some cases through the lens of exclusion. And so I think the work of the church in this season is to think about how we create spaces of meaning making that allow people to see themselves as part of God's unfolding story in this season of human history and as beloved in that and necessary in that unfolding story. Yeah.
Well, Jen, if I can just jump right in there, because I think that this is one of the things that I find consistent when I listen to you talk, and that's that notion of creating these communities of belonging, a place where a person can be and be authentically who they are, and your notion that these are third spaces and so forth. Is that part of the drive that pushes you? I mean, you were saying that you found that in the church yourself at one point, but then moved on. Is that the consistency that runs through what you do?
I would say so. If I had to, sometimes it feels like, especially in this work of spiritual and social entrepreneurship and innovation, right? It kind of feels like you're telling lots of different stories all the time. But if I were going to connect the dots, and it feels quite obvious, right? We know that those of us who have been called to ministry, we often end up doing the very ministry that we need most in our lives, right? As part of our own healing process. And I do think those early days of my youth of feeling excluded, feeling othered, really shaped and molded my worldview. And that those feelings of exclusion were the very ones that drove me and have driven me throughout my life. To want to create these alternative spaces and not really care where it happens, right? I think that's the other element in terms of structure. And I say that meaning, maybe I should get a little more specific there. As an expression of my faith, it feels important for me to be able to do that work, whether it's in the church, because I'm still in the church, y'all. Like I am in the pulpit every Sunday helping lead worship that I'm home, right? I am still on the prayer line with the elders of my church every Monday at 12 p.m. Central, no matter where I am in the world. I've called in from the Netherlands. I've called in from California. I've called in from all over the world, right? So it's not that I don't see the importance of congregation and church as an anchor to my life. It is that I don't see that as the sole place where I am doing and helping facilitate and creating for myself and my loved ones that space. It's an essential one, though, and I am happy to dive into why I think it's essential for me in particular at this phase of my life. But yes, that is the thread that probably remains most consistent.
Well, I as a follow-up on that, I think for me too, there's a feeling though that this community of where people can belong and so forth, that that you have found it in the church, but that's not the welcome place for all people or for more people, and so in some sense, it sounds like you needed to step outside that boundary of the church in order to go to the next step of community. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think that, I found part of it in the church. I don't know that it was fully in the way that my church, or the churches and congregations that I've been a part of throughout my life, that it intended well to a piece of who I was. But I don't know if because of the form, the structure, and in some ways, the theology, right, that was being espoused in the spaces I were, that it really opened space for me to feel like I could authentically be all of me, including being able to like robustly ask my questions, right, in a way that wasn't met with either suspicion or you just need to pray on that, baby, it'll get clear, right? Like, there weren't places for me to wrestle with God. Like, I don't know that the church has always been the space in my life where I felt like I could wrestle with God, that I could really sort out and figure out for myself um, what it meant to be both in relationship with the divine, but also being able to tussle with and argue with and try to shout at the top of my lungs. Um, and work out my soul salvation as we say in the Black church, right? I don't know that the church was always the space for me to feel safe and brave enough to do that. I think in some cases, especially being a church girl at heart, right, there was a particular type of performance that I had to, and I still have to some extent because I'm clergy, right? Only part of me could authentically show up in the church because I was performing a particular identity as church girl and good church girl. Because the 3 on the Enneagram in me likes to perform well. So there's a particular type of church girl that I needed to show up and be. My cousin church girl couldn't show up there. My questioning authority church girl couldn't show up there. Even as I think, for me, one of the great beauties of being a participant in congregational life is the intergenerationality of it all. In a world where we are more segregated by age than ever before, it is one of the few places in my life where I'm regularly encountering in relationship and working out like my stuff with my elders and with younger people. And so I still see a great value in the life of the church, and finding myself a part of a really rich and layered tradition of Christianity that is the AME church, but I think more broadly is just Black church life that reminds me in the times where I feel most desperate and seeking that I'm a part of a lineage of people who have not just survived, but have thrived against conditions of unrest, injustice, and tyranny for hundreds of years and have sang the same songs that I'm singing today, right? As a bold declaration of who God is and who we are to God.
Yeah. So I so appreciate that you are willing to claim your heart for the church and the church's claim on you, really, and to not apologize for it and to not try to even diminish in any way its importance in your life, and you are finding ways to live out these questions, this wrestling outside of the church, and help others do the same. And so there's this unapologetic both and going on with you that feels, I think, really right for this conversation, but also for this moment. And so I'd love to get granular a little bit with one of those things that you helped to start and to give shape to, and it's the People Supper. And so for those who aren't familiar with People Supper, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it. But let's use that as kind of a case, if you will, of how meaning making and people's quest for meaning and belonging kind of led you, or was a driver for starting this ministry. I'm going to call it a ministry, and what it unlocked for folks, what it unlocked for you. Will you just play with that a little bit, give in light of Gil's monograph and this map of meaning making?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that invitation, Lisa, because it's been, gosh, almost a decade since the People's Supper and the formation of foundational ideas that would become the People's Supper got started. And so I think the first thing that the People's Supper taught me, and for those who don't know, the People's Supper was a project that I co-founded with several friends in the wake of the 2016 presidential election cycle, noticing at the time, which unfortunately, right, it still remains consistent, the sort of vitriolic nature of our politics and how it was seeping into the fabric of our um, day-to-day life, insofar as people were beginning to talk to one another not as people, but as um, avatars on a screen who they were having an argument with, right? And so the People's Supper was really started out of a desire by myself and to colleagues and friends to create spaces for folks to have a conversation again in a way that felt um, generative and based in our shared and understanding of what it is to be human. And so using the dinner table as a space, as a common space where people, regardless of where you come from, who you are, we all need to eat, right?
Mm.
Um, and that as a sort of incubator and technology for story-based questions that unlocked for people the ability to be authentically themselves, even as we were tackling in those conversations, everything from differences in racial identity and their implications to political differences to helping folks navigate how they think about themselves as members of the community. So we did a series of suppers several years ago in Erie, Pennsylvania, and one of the questions we asked is, "Why do you call Erie home?" This was a broad variety of stakeholders from different socioeconomic, racial, religious backgrounds. Um, and so that project, which started as a project called 100 Days, 100 Dinners, and was intended to be a way to shift the conversation in the first 100 days of the first Trump administration. So wanting people to be able to talk to one another as human again has been ongoing since then and has done over, 2,000 suppers across the world. And it's been a really powerful, I think, experiment in micro community. And what sort of communities can we create in sharing a meal over a short period of time? And how might we be transformed by the invitation to bear witness to one another's stories and in bearing witness to one another's stories affirm our humanity, even if there might be issues that we deeply disagree on. That's not to say it hasn't been challenging. It isn't to say that there have not been things at those tables that have been said that have wounded or transgressed, but how do we create the container through which we can address that, right? It's a practice. And I think at its best, communal faith life is about practicing what it means to be human with one another for the sake of creating the conditions for flourishing for all of us to thrive, both in relationship to one another and relationship to the natural world of which we are a part. And so that is sort of, I think, a concrete example of one way and one technology that I've used throughout the course of my lifetime as a tool for thinking about how we create spaces of belonging.
It's fascinating to me that this technology, as you call it, which is language we're getting more familiar with in this conversation, is people gathered around the table. And there may be nothing more ancient to being human and being the church than gathering around the table. And so it's interesting that in order to see it and claim it, sometimes we have to do it outside of our usual routines in order to allow ourselves to reclaim it as a central piece of spiritual practice in this moment. Because quite literally, you've located it outside the church. I'm not to say that some of these dinners weren't located in church halls and such, but mostly probably they were around people's homes or in different settings, and so I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that once we realize as people that there's always going to be new, but most of the ways that we are human are ancient, right? Like they're
Ecclesiastes, right? Nothing new under the
right.
sun.
There's
Yeah.
nothing
Right.
new under the sun, but perhaps different forms that it
Mhm.
takes, right? Then I think there's an opportunity for us to see ourselves again as a part of God's unfolding story and identify not just with the moment that we've been called to live and breathe into that story, but with those who've come before us. And so I think that's why, for me, the role of um, honoring and doing our work and honoring lineage and ancestors and those in the faith who've come before has been so essential to sort of my grounding, um, and how I make sense both of my faith and of the world in this season, and that I have been called into it. And I'll say that has been particularly important to me as I've become a mother over the past 5 years. And I think
Mhm.
about the stories that my children are inheriting both from me, and my lineage, but also from my husband's lineage. So, among the many differences that I navigate in my life is that my husband is Jewish, and we're raising our kids with Judaism being their primary religious home in this season. And so, what does it mean for my son to come from both people who survived the horrors of chattel slavery, but also folks who survived the horrors of the Holocaust, right? Like that, both of those things are
Mm.
true in their narratives and stories, and are certainly histories of trauma, but also histories of survival and perseverance, of resilience, that are all true and wrapped up in who they are.
Well, that's a piece that it comes out differently when I listen to you talk. One of the things that I was working on in developing that field in the monograph was that my generation and generations before me kind of grew up with a very strict binary, that if you were inside the church, you were in sacred space. Once you walked out the door, you were in secular space. And it was very clear, and so among other things, that makes it very hard for people who have that active binary to look out into the culture and to see things
Mhm.
that are in fact, faith-based and spirit-led. And you've walked across that boundary intentionally and continuously. So you're able to take, that which belongs to faith and the sacred with you as you go wherever you go. So how about from the other side? I mean, you sit on so many boards, you work with so many people, you are connected with so many other programs. Do people who are coming to those programs and to those gatherings and to those communities, when they come because it's resonating for them, do they see that as sacred for themselves? In other words, can they see that they're coming from a place, but it is still within that sacred?
Yeah, I think that folks who are most attracted to what I'm calling in this conversation, which I'm curious about the language I'm using to
Yeah.
describe this, even as we're talking, but um, in these third spaces are people who are naturally inclined and curious about the expansion of the holy, right? And I would argue that perhaps that's more faithful return to the nature of the early church, right? That
Hmm.
um, that as the church over history got more concentrated, right, in the physical edifice and the polity of our traditions, right, um, there's always been spaces that we set aside as holy. Now, whether that happened within the four walls of a congregational context, or if it happened, I think about my own lineage, right, within the sacredness of the hush harbors during an enslaved period, where people were gathering
Hmm.
outdoors and communing with spirit. I think the notion that there are spaces that we would consider secular and those that we consider sacred, I think, are actually relatively new in human experience and human history. um, that for most people, for most of the arc of time, those two things have been seen as just the way things are and in tandem with one another. And so I'd argue that perhaps what we're doing in this time is returning to something much more ancient, much more um, much more I don't know. I bristle against language of true, right? But much
Sure.
much more integrated to the nature of um, perhaps what the intentions of our faith were in its earliest expressions and days. And so, to me, I understand this moment not just as being a response to, but perhaps an expansion of what and how we understand our engagement with that which we call sacred, and sort of a flattening of that doesn't just need to happen in one particular space that is set apart, but that it's something that you can carry with you and integrate with you into different areas and spaces within your life that you're encountering.
Yeah. I think that I would at least want to counter to say that that this has not been a relatively new experience for so many people, particularly if you are white and you are Western European. You came with that kind of Cartesian, kind of dualism. With something is either sacred or it is, secular. And so I think that has been so ingrained in such a large part of the world that I come from that it makes us blind to see when faith is acting outside of what we think is a sacred space. And so much that is out there that is actually building. One of the things that I always, bristle against is that we have lost the sense of the common good. That is just, it has no voice in our culture at this moment. And yet when we find the kinds of things that you're describing, where people find their third space and they sit in community, we can't recognize that as a movement of the holy. We can't see that as something that has sacred worth of its own. And so we still have these kind of competing worldviews that kind of block us, if that makes sense.
I think that, I think that absolutely makes sense. And as I'm thinking about the long arc of history, and this is the influence, y'all, I'm on the board of the Fetzer Institute in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we like to say we have a 500-year mission, right? So even thinking about sort of the advent of the Enlightenment and thinking about the move towards reason, I would count that, Gil, as like a relatively recent phenomenon in human history,
Okay.
right? If
Sure.
we're talking about,
Sure.
that's when I say that, I mean, if we're thinking about thousands of years of human history and the evolution of
Yeah.
our species, this is a relatively recent, over the last 500 years ago. So
And see,
phenomenon.
here I thought you were just talking about when I had hair.
No, no. I'm thinking about it in the long arc.
Yeah.
You all have often heard me joke. I'm so grateful that I think in terms of eternities rather than election cycles, right? Like thinking about it in the long arc, the 7 generations, as some of our indigenous siblings talk about, right? As a framework for understanding history. So I don't disagree with you, Gil. I just,
Sure.
my recency bias is different. Maybe my timeline is a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about that and moving to a non-binary kind of way of experiencing the holy, one of the things that we've been influenced by a number of folks who talk about this, how stuck we are in our ability to imagine, right? And to nurture imagination, or even we might say holy imagination. And so I'm curious, from your perspective and your experience in the church, which you've said is sort of limiting for the fullness of how you grow as a beloved child of God and find belonging and places to wrestle with God. Like, how might we nurture holy imagination? And I'm going to say, our audience is largely leaders in the church. So how might we nurture holy imagination in the church for the sake of this sort of non-binary view of where the Spirit is moving and where we, can nurture human flourishing and formation? Yeah.
And this is,
And if you can solve this, like,
yeah,
we're
you know what,
done,
Lisa, I don't know that I have a total, I don't know if I have a total answer for you, but I do know where I'm finding my own sense of spiritual imagination in this season. And it's in the notion of play. And I think for me, as a mother of two who are 5 and under, the reintroduction of play into my life has been a sacred intervention that was desperately needed for me. And it's thinking about seeing my son Max building with Legos and seeing those Legos transform from, a house to a bulldozer to a helicopter, right? That there are all these ways in which he is stretching and thinking about these basic components and parts that he's been given and dreaming up something to do with it, right? Without sort of limitations or it's almost like boundaryless, right? Like the way in which he can create and imagine. And so I wonder about how we reincorporate notions of play and helping people rediscover that sort of childlike gentleness and creativity into the work of the church, and how we find ways to play together in addition to studying together and, all of the other things that happen in a church collectively. It's incorporating art and like music and unstructured time, which is hard for me as a very, type A, Enneagram 3 type of mom that has activities planned out. Like one of the gifts this week, for example, is that my kids were out of school. They had a day off from their preschool. And as much as I normally have like a morning activity scheduled, an afternoon activity scheduled, an evening activity scheduled during those type of days, they spent the most of the day in the house. My in-laws came over and watched them. And to see what the joy of unstructured time that did not have expectations did. I mean, zip lines were created in my house for better or worse, again, because grandma was there and mama wouldn't have played that, but grandma let them, right? Like there were just things that were happening that I couldn't have imagined happening with, my belt and like a hanger, right? Like, and so I say all that to say that perhaps in the church, some of our greatest teachers around this question of imagination are the young people that that are present, right? Whose brains have not been fully formed yet and fixed with the sort of linear and binary thinking that I know I'm still recovering from, even though, folks might say that they see me as a non-binary thinker. My husband would strongly disagree with you. Right? Like to a fault, right? So that's my answer for you. It's a long-winded answer, but like how can we reimagine and infuse play into what we're doing?
Yeah.
Let's stay with that a little bit, because I think that this is what is so confusing out on that landscape out there, that people are doing things that don't get recognized for the values that they hold because they don't fit categories that have already been established. And so if you're in the church, there's this issue of credentialing, and you can't really lead unless you've gone through all the stages and been prepared and that kind of business. But yet once you step outside the church, there's an open field to play on. And so just like you were talking about your son making either a building or a helicopter out of Legos, you've already gone through 2, 3, or 4 of those kinds of reconstructions yourself with the work that you do. You start out with suppers, you end up with Faith Matters, you will move on to, okay. So talk about that a little bit. If there is this freedom of flow, what is it like to continually invent and continually move on? And you've mentioned it before about the stages of entrepreneurialism. How do you think about the consistency of something that continues to morph even in your own work?
What comes to mind as I think about that question and think about the sort of open field of play, as you've described it outside the church, is that fact that, and this goes back to the Legos metaphor to some extent, the only way that I was able to go outside and play without getting completely subsumed or overwhelmed by the options presented before me is because I had the building blocks, right, in my hand with which to build. So I even think about Max and his Legos, right? He's building from something, right? There have been these toys created that are called Legos in his case, right? That are different sizes and shapes, and that someone has thought about and put together and these variety of packets for him to build from. And so, as somebody who, again, has never left the church, I actually think that part of the building blocks that I was given to be able to play in imagination was a really firm foundation from mentors who, in their own right, were thinking differently about church, but who gave me the tools of scripture in some cases and how to wrestle with it, right? Who gave me the tools of um, theology, gave me the tools of tradition, the traditions of my church, right? That form the building blocks through which I felt safe enough to go out and play with. And so, I think about one of my dear mentors, Reverend Dr. Reggie Blunt, who's at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, who saw me as a 16-year-old in Chicago, a good AME church girl, and led me through this program that at the time was called Faith Passage at Garrett. That was thinking about how to empower teenagers to think about how they act on their faith. And so had me reading Desmond Tutu, had me reading Martin Luther King through a theological lens at 16. And as I was spending my time at this Methodist youth camp, right, that became like, a building block for me as I, later in seminary went to get to had the opportunity to sit at the feet of Desmond Tutu and thanked him, right, for the way in which Ubuntu theology reshaped my life and my understanding of people, right? So I say all that to say, like, a metaphor that I've often used and continue to use in my life is that of composting, right? That there's something about the building blocks, using the building blocks in which I've been given to fertilize new things. And there's something about being in a community of people who saw in me the spark and potential to create and who nurtured that creativity. And so it's both for me, the safety of play and imagination within the boundaries I was given and tools that I was given. More importantly, the people who were giving me those tools, who saw me as a creative being, and rather than stifling that creativity or attempting to make it fit into a particular model, in my case of ministry, right, or a particular model of vocational trajectory, and even if that's one that they themselves were most familiar with, right? They saw that there was something else happening and that the Holy Spirit was moving in a different way in my life and nurtured that. And I think that I don't know that I can say enough about what a gift that is in terms of the field of play having some tools, some play items, some boundaries. I would not let my kids play in an open field by a highway, but I would let them play in a space that has a gate, right? That is able to hold and contain them as they're doing that exploration. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the metaphor kept flying and going with me.
That's really helpful. And the other part about that is that when you look out on this new religious landscape, I mean, I'm just using language that is trying to say there's a different way of looking at what's happening out there. There is so much happening out there. But I also have a sense that there's a good bit of what's happening that is not working off of foundational pieces. It's working off of preferences. It's working off of biases. It's working off of wishful thinking. It's working off of some very dark thoughts at times. And so, are you conscious in your work and in these third places that you build? Are you conscious of providing foundational pieces for people?
Yes, I think for the work that I think was essential for my tenure at Faith Matters and the way that I continue to sort of see things unfolding in my vocational trajectory is that it was all grounded in lineage and wisdom, right? Like there was something in the case of F&M grounded in a really firm foundation of womanist theological thought and ethics and expression, right? So it was building from the work of folks like Emily Towns, the work of our grandmothers, right? And great grandmothers and how they lived and expressed and experienced faith and community. So it came from something that we knew to be true and knew to be nurturing and nourishing rather than fundamentally destructive. And I don't know that there have been curated enough spaces of discernment for people in this era to know the difference, right? Like, I
Fair enough.
think that there's not, and to me, this is maybe a slight indictment of the church, but I don't know that we've spent enough time over the past several decades really thinking about and allowing folks to have an expansive definition of spiritual formation that includes discernment, right? That includes processes for and structures for holding questions and discernment and figuring out what is holy for you, right? How do you
Right.
hold complexity? How do you hold disagreement? Right, all of those things. Um, and because we have largely, um, I would say, abdicated that formational role to the outside world, what you get is, again, things like ideology and politics influencing how people think about their theology and lived experience of church rather than the opposite, rather than folks' theology and lived understanding of um, faith in the message of Jesus that I think is fundamentally grounded in love, right? As a space to belong, influencing the politics, the ideology that is largely driving how people are showing up in public. Now, how they show up in private is a different thing, I think, but how people, the loudest people, are showing up in public these days. And so,
Mhm.
I talk a lot with my friend Angie Thurston, the Sacred Design Lab, about the role of formation and spiritual formation. I do think it's essential for how we move forward, and also for those of us who do think have a discernment practice for ourselves, discerning what projects, right, like pass the smell test. Because
Mhm.
also throughout human history, there have been a lot of charismatic people who started a lot of churches that were not intended to do um, be spaces of belonging, but rather monuments to themselves. And so
Yeah.
all of those are key, I think, as we're talking about this work.
I'm hearing your words as such an encouragement, actually, to leaders today in the church to experience, to claim the value of the church's work in spiritual formation, right? And so, just to borrow your Legos metaphor and maybe stretch it too far, I don't know, but that if we really see the work of helping provide those building blocks and less about directing how the house gets built or the church or the whatever is getting built, but really deepen the work on the building blocks themselves, the scripture, the story of Jesus, how we communicate with each other and form community, this sort of essential building blocks, and really help equip people, form people to be spiritual beings in the world, that there is such an important place for the work of the church today, and that we claim it and not abdicate it. And I just hear your words as so encouraging. So I'm going to move us to our
Yeah.
final question
Yeah.
that we're asking all our guests. So, what's one practice or perspective that helps you stay grounded and open to God's new thing in this season?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I feel like I've been consistent. It's not just a metaphor with me, but y'all, I've built more Lego sets in the last 6 months than I've ever. I was not a Lego girly. I was an arts girl growing up, arts and dance and music person. Um, and so I do actually think about it as a spiritual practice. The act of play with my children is a spiritual practice. As I think about sort of my life after the last couple of years, I remember having a conversation with a friend like 2 years ago when my daughter was born. I was like, breastfeeding was a spiritual practice for me, but
Mhm,
as
mhm.
I'm trying, well, it's true, right? It was like a time set apart that I was stuck in a space where I was nurturing and often like reflecting
Mm.
a lot on God's nurture for me as I was nurturing my baby. But the evolution from there to like Lego sets with Max and Celia Pearl and like just my kids, right? That there's something about the play that feels so
Yeah.
essential, um, both in understanding motherhood as a part of my vocational identity and maybe one of my highest callings in this season, which for folks who know me probably sounds I know how that probably sounds. Not to say that, but it's true, right? Like I'm still my active entrepreneurial self. It's just that this season of my life has called me to slow down and play with Legos.
Yeah.
I think often, the Holy Spirit slows us down in preparation for what is emerging. And so I'm excited to see in 5 years what all that Lego building will contribute to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's its own kind of entrepreneurial spirit in you that is leading you to this open, creative play. So it's really good. Good. Jen, it is always so good to be with you. I always feel more hopeful about the witness of the church when I'm with you. So thank you for that gift.
Well, I'm not giving up on it yet, y'all. There's a reason that we're called to be here. And I think that for all of my open and secret complaints about the structure of church, we're needed now more than ever before to take up our rightful role, especially in this role of formation. What I'm realizing is the absence of the church and our role in formation, someone else will pick it up. And I think we are seeing the lived consequences of someone else is picking it up. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Jen. It's grand to talk with you again.
Yeah,
I appreciate
absolutely.
you.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you for the invitation to be with you. I've missed y'all, so it's really good to catch up.
Same.